I think we can officially say good afternoon and welcome. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. We really have had a tremendous response to this training, and we're really grateful to all of you for taking the time to join us. I saw new names and familiar names. We are really appreciative of this opportunity through a HUD grant to spend time focusing on fair housing rights specifically for Black and African American communities. I'm Liz Keegan. I'm the Director of Education and Outreach at the Fair Housing Center of West Michigan. And joining me to co-present today is Brianna Miranda, our Education and Outreach Coordinator. So we will be jointly presenting a lot of information, as always, to you this afternoon. A little bit of housekeeping. You are all muted and your cameras are off, so we are not able to hear you. We are recording this session and we will make it available online after the class, but we will halt the recording before Q&A at the end, as we really do want people to feel free to ask tough questions or important questions, and so we will allow for that during that time. Please use the Q&A feature to ask clarifying questions. They can get lost sometimes in the chat. And as I said, we will save time for questions at the end. You're welcome to plug them in at any time, and we will, of course, circle back to those. We are taking attendance through an evaluation feature. It's a separate SurveyMonkey evaluation that will open in your browser, so please look for that. If you do want a certificate, you can request one by completing that evaluation. And that feedback is always very helpful to us in terms of how we're doing and what you would like to see from us as well. So please do take a few moments to fill out the evaluation. We also provided handouts by email, so hopefully you received that. That was earlier today, depending on when you registered. So be sure to look for those. And if you didn't get it, please send a message to us and we'll make sure you get those handouts. So I think with all of that housekeeping underway, we've introduced ourselves. We encourage you to visit our website, follow us on Facebook. We also have a now active presence on LinkedIn. We share a lot of good information, but really I can't say enough about our website. We've got a ton of good information on there. So if you haven't visited that already, please do. We've got some more trainings coming online, and we're keeping that up to date. So check that out. We will be covering a lot of information, and we really will not do justice, I can promise, to this important topic, because there's a lot of history, there's a lot of law, there's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of cases, a lot of fair housing protections, but we're going to do our best to review what is happening in fair housing, what is happening in terms of gaps for access to equal housing opportunity based on race, color, and national origin. We'll talk about cases. We'll talk about specific hot topics like harassment and criminal background screening. We will close with information on how housing discrimination can be reported and how you can get involved. So again, we've prepared a lot of information for you today, and we do want to acknowledge that there's a lot to cover. I also want to share a content warning. We will be sharing real-life examples of housing discrimination and other incidents that may be traumatizing or difficult to hear or discuss. So please do take care of yourselves and be aware. We want to acknowledge we are covering difficult topics. We also want to share a note on the language in this training. As a civil rights organization, we are very aware there's not universal agreement on the appropriate race or ethnicity labels for diverse populations that we have here in the United States, in Michigan and West Michigan, or even whether or not anything should be capitalized. So we intend to be inclusive rather than exclusive, and in no case do we want to diminish any significance of the viewpoint of any person or injure any person or groups through the use of our terminology, on our technology call. When we are using data or resources or reference specifically any quotations, we will use the source terminology. So you will see perhaps some different language based on what we're sharing. Quick introduction to the Fair Housing Center. If you're new to us, I know many of you are not. We were founded in 1980 in the greater Grand Rapids area. We are a nonprofit organization. We do not have attorneys on staff, therefore we cannot provide any legal advice, which one follows the other there. All the information that we're sharing today is provided for educational purposes only. Our mission is to prevent and eliminate illegal housing discrimination, ensure equal housing opportunity, and promote inclusive communities. So I also want to note this is the first in a three-part series. We will also be looking at fair housing rights specific to Native American and Indigenous communities, as well as a separate training looking at fair housing rights for Latinx or Hispanic communities. So stay tuned for details on those. We're really appreciative to HUD for the opportunity to really think about these specific fair housing barriers to those groups. Of course, we're going to acknowledge there have been decades worth of barriers to housing choice. The federal government played a significant role in that. Some of you are going to be familiar with this history, but we feel it's very important to better understand how we got here and really more importantly, what we can do going forward, that we look at this history. We had policies that were implemented and significantly enforced that segregated populations by race in housing across communities, across neighborhoods, across the country. Federal housing policies, tax policies, lending programs, and just blatant outright discrimination have contributed, along with private market housing practices, to widespread racial segregation. We have made progress, but we have not come all of the way, to borrow from Dr. King. We're jumping back to the 1930s and 1940s, thinking about restrictive covenants. These are documents attached to properties, housing, that literally prohibited groups from owning, spending time on, leasing, renting, being employed on property. So this is part of those significant barriers because it was literally illegal. For example, here, a Seattle restrictive covenant that was attached to a property that said no property shall be at any time sold, conveyed, rented, or leased to any person or persons not of the white or Caucasian race. In fact, they only made an exemption for domestic servants who were not white or Caucasian to actually be employed. As long as they were employed by a white person, they were allowed on the property. This is actually a local West Michigan deed that carried forward. It's a document from the late 40s, but carried forward the original restrictive covenants that included language restricting the herein described premises as not to be sold to or occupied by any person with a perceptible strain of Negro blood. Again, using the language of the time here. These are still on the books in many communities. We do have a step forward here in Michigan to strike these restrictive deeds legally from the properties. But there have been stories across the country making the news where people purchase a home and then find that their group that they belong to by race or national origin or skin color was a prohibited party. So it causes real doubt in terms of, do I want to live here? Is it safe for me to live here? How can I take action against this? And all these years later, we are making progress. Michigan does have a restrictive covenant law on the books that can help remove those covenants. That passed in 2022, so hopefully we'll start to see more activity there. It can be expensive legally to strike these down. It's also important that we pay attention to, why does this matter? Why are we looking at this? There was a really interesting effort out of Delaware County in Indiana. A brilliant mapper who knows how to use GIS layered racially restrictive covenants, located, identified, and mapped communities, neighborhoods that had racially restrictive covenants in this area, and then layered it with the percentage of non-white residents from 2010 census data. So if you look at these shapes, these red shapes, you can see they are very lightly shaded. There's only 2 or 3 that have achieved any sort of racial integration at all. So while these were done in the 30s, very commonly late 20s, 30s, and early 40s, here we are looking at their impact today. Conditions during the Great Depression, which ran from 1929 to 1939, made it very difficult for homeowners to make monthly mortgage payments and led to record home foreclosures at the time. The Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, was created in 1933 to refinance home mortgages that were in default or that people were behind on paying, to prevent foreclosures and expand home buying opportunities by lending at lower interest rates. So this was an attempt to really slow this incredible crisis. They did so by creating residential security maps. This was supposed to assess the level of risk for providing home loans in different neighborhoods across the country. They were color-coded by mortgage security risk. So again, this was supposed to be about lending risk, but when the over 200 communities were actually mapped and individuals, professionals were sent out to do this work, to do this mapping, they took into account race, specifically the percentage of Black people. Also, any minority or ethnic groups were noted. Some religions were noted. So they really took people into factor as to whether or not this was a desirable neighborhood and whether it was a good risk or not for these incredibly important resources to be made available, either new loans or refinances that would help people keep their loans. So they were conditioned on race. The communities of color were often graded as hazardous and shaded in red. This included neighborhoods that even had very small percentages of Black residents. So the gradings were based on housing professionals, real estate professionals, including appraisers, and really became encoded into the system that was used well beyond its original intent and has kind of perpetuated a lot of the issues that we're seeing and trying to address today. This is a map of all the cities that were large enough at the time in the 1930s to get mapped, so to speak. I think a lot of people think that every community has a map like these, and that is not necessarily the case. We had a handful here in Michigan. I think there were about 6 cities. Jackson and Detroit, Kalamazoo come to mind, in addition to Grand Rapids and Muskegon, which we'll look at. But you can also tell by the dots on this map, kind of the number of neighborhoods that were graded by the colors. Red was that failing grade, green and blue were kind of the A and B, and yellow was C, so not a passing grade. And if you look at the colors of the dots, the size of these colors within the circles indicate how many communities were graded that way. So for example, if you look at Sioux City or Wichita, kind of in the central area, you can see those dots are primarily red. So a lot of those communities were just written off as too risky to invest in. Here are the HOLC maps for Grand Rapids on the left and Greater Muskegon, Muskegon Heights, and North Muskegon here in West Michigan. These are specific to our service area, but as I mentioned, there are other cities. You can see the Muskegon area map had a lot of neighborhoods that were redlined, specifically red as that failing grade of D. Over 80% of Grand Rapids was scored low in the yellow or red categories. So this is kind of drilling in. One of the interesting things, if you have time, is to look at each of these neighborhoods has a sheet that looks exactly like this that gives detail why the grade was given. So we can learn a little bit about what influenced the decision to score these neighborhoods this way. And we chose where the Fair Housing Center is located here at the Hall and Division corner, the D2 neighborhood here. You can tell they took into account the type of habitats and in fact inhabitants, and in fact labeled them as detrimental and gave more details. There were what they considered at the time infiltrations of Italians and Negroes. There were relief families present. That means families accepting subsidies from the government or welfare. So that influenced the desirability and the grade, which was trending down for the next 10 to 15 years. So the legacy, what does this mean? How are we bringing this forward? Well, the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, better known as the NCRC, says that most of the neighborhoods that were graded as high risk or hazardous 80 years ago are low to moderate income today. So that barrier to capital, that barrier to investment, being labeled as risky has tremendous ripple effects going forward. Additionally, most of those HOLC graded hazarded areas, almost 64%, continue to be minority neighborhoods now. So it's kind of maintained that segregation and also ensured that people of color were living in neighborhoods that were not kept up over time. So this was not the residents' fault. This was something that was policy. Generations of people of color were barred from owning homes in their own communities, pardon me. Which impacted the ability, of course, to transfer wealth across generations. Buying a home is known as the American dream. Most people aspire to it, not everyone, but a lot of the driving force behind home ownership is that ability to build wealth and then pass that on to future generations and people that are important to you. So this really does cause that harm that we're continuing to see today. So other explicitly discriminatory principles and practices perpetuated this unfounded association that's really now associating race and risk in housing and financial markets. So this really laid the groundwork and cemented the practices. They promoted the idea that a home should be valued based on its neighborhood, who lived there, and that a homogeneous all-white neighborhood held the highest value. So we'll kind of switch gears a little bit and look at what are the laws and protections, what are the steps that we have taken to expand fair housing rights and encode fair housing protections. I will turn it over to Bree.
Thanks, Liz. So yeah, we have all that. Liz, covered kind of that history, very brief history, but very
We'll
important
circle back
history.
to
Yeah,
it.
that kind of brought us to where we are today, and kind of how fair housing can now play a factor in all of that harm that was done in the past, and how we can kind of move forward from there. So looking at fair housing laws, fair housing is the right to choose housing free from unlawful discrimination in any housing transaction. So often people think of it maybe in rental and sales, but it also is, there's protections in lending, zoning, land use, insurance. Anytime there is an empty lot that is intended to have a home is protected. And it's based on what we call protected classes that are covered at all the federal, state, and local level. Some of those protected classes include Um, at the federal level, race, color, national origin, so where somebody is from, gender, which includes sexual orientation and gender identity, religion, disability status, both mental and physical disabilities, familial status, which is the presence of children under the age of 18 in the home. So not just a typical family of two parents, two kids. It can be grandparents raising grandchildren, siblings raising siblings. It could be pregnant women or pregnant people, and it can be if somebody's in the process of getting adoption or fostering. So if there is children in the house, then that protection comes into place. The HUD Equal Access Rule includes anybody that is any federal funded housing or accepting federal funding in like so subsidies and things like that. So these are additional protected classes: marital status, sexual orientation, gender identity, and then they have a different definition of family, age, and disability. So those are things to be looked at, and those are linked if you are a housing provider and have federal funding. And then at the state level, we have marital status, which is whether or not you're married, widowed, divorced, separated. Age, with an exception of senior housing, so that 55 and 62 and older housing. And then newly, sexual orientation and gender identity are now protected in the state of Michigan as of this year. Some examples of discrimination that we see because of somebody's race or skin color or national origin. Just a few here. We'll go over some cases that will kind of bring light to some of these examples, but the flat out refusal to show a home or sell a home, maybe giving conflicting or differing information, being steered into certain neighborhoods. We often see this like, oh, well, kind of linking to the next one. It's neighborhood's not right for you. Maybe you'll feel better over here. Again, fair housing is all about housing choice and the ability to choose where you want to live based on, what you're looking for. And discrimination should not play a part in that. Additionally, maybe, again, having different terms and conditions, price changes, changing between maybe when you called and then when they see you in person, and they're judging based on your race, skin color, or national origin.
So really any difference in treatment, there's so many advocates on the call, any difference in treatment that you feel is related to race or skin color or national origin has the potential to be a fair housing issue. If you are a housing provider, keep that same radar. And if you have a feeling that there's a difference that needs to be examined to improve your practices, that's the opportunity to do it.
Yeah, and then additionally, there was an update in 2023 to the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act. There was a broader definition of race included that included hair texture and protective hairstyles. And for the purposes of this definition, protective hairstyles includes, but not limited to, braids, locks, and twists. So adding that element that because it did come out of an employment case, people are being discriminated against because of their hair, and so that protection was added in addition to race, or I guess expanded.
Yeah, it was a brand new definition and a very inclusive one now on the books.
Yes. And then at the state level, we also have some pending source of income protections. There is some word they're waiting on the governor's desk to be signed. So this is really close in coming that we could see these protections anytime soon. And together they would amend both the Landlord Tenant Act and the Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act. And it includes any income that should be looked at as income could be public housing assistance, vouchers, veterans benefits, SSI, or in any kind of program that's administered by a federal, state, local, or nonprofit entity. However, it does not include any income derived in an illegal matter. And then there is an exemption within that law that would exempt landlords with fewer than 5 units in Michigan.
So stay tuned.
Mhm. And we will be pushing out information once that goes into effect. So stay on the lookout for that as well. There is some additional proposed legislation for the Michigan Fair Chance Access to Housing Act. Chance Access to Housing Act that prohibits landlords from requiring the disclosure of criminal records. And this, we've seen these different types of bills in place in different cities. Detroit, I believe, has one. And then across the country, some other places have put these into effect. If you are interested in this, the Michigan Coalition Against Homelessness is doing some push on those legislative efforts. And then we have seen this in times popping up at the federal level as well.
Mhm.
Now, looking at some data, the National Fair Housing Alliance captured some information and they produced a trends report that showed that there were over 34,000 fair housing complaints captured in 2023, which was the highest record number since they started kind of producing this report. And it's been the 3rd year in a row, which a high milestone has been met. Race was the 2nd largest basis of complaints at over 5,000 complaints. And then disability continues to be the highest complaint basis. That is also something that we'll show on ours as well. But disability tends to be the highest, but race is definitely the 2nd largest. And then there were 824 complaints based on color reported, which was an increase of 35%. They were largely rental complaints and then harassment complaints as well.
Mhm. And again, color under federal law is defined as skin color. So this is people feeling like they're experiencing differences in treatment based on their skin color, which can be paired with national origin and or race. All of the protections can be combined in allegations. So we just wanted to kind of share that look at, specifically what people are reporting that they're experiencing across the country.
Yeah, and then looking at our caseload, again, like I mentioned, disability tends to be the highest, but race and color is kind of following that. It does represent 31% of our caseload, with disability taking up 52% of our caseload. However, last year, we managed 276 cases altogether, which was a highest caseload ever recorded of managing in our history. So we did have 140 cases that were new last year, but that we managed 276 cases as cases kind of can take some time to uncover. And then looking at, we pulled some 5-year data since 2019. What does race allegations, race, color, and national origin allegations look like on our caseload? We had 330 allegations total between all 3 of those, which represented 28% of the allegations over the last 5 years. As you can see, rental tends to be the highest, but then after that goes, sales, advertising, and mortgage. And you can see that race and color tend to be higher than national origin, and there's different factors that feed into that. But we wanted you guys to just see this data that it is a large portion of our cases.
And it happens in all of these different transaction types as well. As you mentioned, Bree, people tend to think, oh, rental housing is where discrimination occurs. And that's true. It's about half of our caseload, but it can be across the entire housing process.
Yeah, and then this is we just wanted to show the trends throughout the years. As you can see, there were some spikes and some lows, but as you can see, as we're continuing on with this year, it is from 2023 to 2024, it is on the rise again. And again, there's a lot of factors that feed into this. Oftentimes, people are fearing retaliation and not reporting it. They may not know it's occurring. We are in a very unsteady, maybe uncomfortable housing market for a lot of folks. And so there's a lot of factors that play into this. People may not know it's happening because they're just looking for housing and trying to get where they are. They're not paying attention to what's occurring to them. So, there's a lot of factors that feed into this, but it is something we're seeing on the rise.
hmm Generally, our caseload is going up, and we expect to see, a continuation of these types of case brought to our attention. We do also want to kind of look at some data about that homeownership gap and appraisal discrimination, which is something we've been talking about for quite a few years. This is updated data from the National Association of Realtors. And again, check your email for the handouts and the slides, because we did link to a lot of reports and a lot of backup information. So you can check that out for yourself. Hopefully the links are clickable in your handout. But this looks at, again, kind of a 10-year look back at home ownership rates. The white community has, started to really increase a bit. We see the Black community took a real long, slow dip. It has started to recover, but only 44% in terms of homeownership rates in 2022. Compared to the green line is the Hispanic community, that light blue is Asian community as well. So we'll look at this kind of, what does this data mean? What do these slight increases and decreases mean? The Black homeownership rate has slightly increased. This is almost 1 million more Black American homeowners. It's encouraging to have this slight upward trend, but it's not matching the pace of growth seen in other racial and ethnic groups. The Black homeownership rate overall remains below 45%, which is well below the rate of any other group, as you can picture that red line on the bottom of the chart. Some positives: the Asian American homeownership rates have increased 6%. That means 1.5 million more Asian American homeowners in the last 10 years. Hispanic home ownership rates have also increased a bit, 5.4%. That's 3.2 million more Hispanic homeowners. White homeownership rates did increase, but only to the tune of about 65,000 more white homeowners. It's worth noting, even though that disparity in those homeownership rates between Black and white households specifically showed a slight decrease in 2022, the disparity remains higher than it was a decade ago. And this kind of mirrors what we've heard from the National Fair Housing Alliance, that Black homeownership levels had dropped to, similar time periods in the 1890s. That was a 2022 report from the National Fair Housing Alliance that was really startling. So it does also, of course, vary by state, from 19% to 57%, and Michigan's rate is about 45%. Driving down a little bit deeper into Kent County, the homeownership rates here on the right are 1970 data for both Black and white homeowners compared with 2021 data. So it's not only that the rate has dropped significantly from 1970, from 50% to 35% for the Black community, but the disparity is widening. There was very little change comparatively in the white levels of homeownership between 1970 and 2021. There's a lot of factors that come into this widening of the gap. Housing affordability, of course, activity from outside investors has been really strongly drawn to West Michigan, gentrification of neighborhoods, mortgage lending disparities. We have a whole new report on that is linked in blue here on this slide. You can read a lot more local data there. And I also wanted to share, within the city of Grand Rapids, the home ownership rate for Black community members in 2022 was 36.7%. So we are not seeing the gains that could be made. Some of you have heard us talk about, there's great information from the Brookings Institute that we recommend you check out. There's a really important 2018 study that looked at how homes in majority Black neighborhoods have been undervalued. They estimate at least $48,000 per home on average. This leads to a 156 billion with a B cumulative loss in value nationwide. Some silver lining: we are seeing home values are increasing on average 84% in majority Black zip codes over kind of this 2016 to 2023 timeframe. This is outpacing the growth in white zip codes, where values only grew 69%. So again, these studies are linked, and we encourage you to check those out. So a little bit of a silver lining, but overall, it's really important to be aware. This is some data from Zillow bringing us full circle. We've got our redlining map from Grand Rapids Homeownership Loan Corporation, the HOLC map on the right. So that's from, I think ours is the late 30s. Looking at, what's the legacy of that? We kind of can see they took home values, median home values, and tied it to the same grading system, the same colors. So if a home was graded A or green, in 1997, it was just under 200,000. Well, now that home value is over doubled to over 400,000. So those scores definitely played a role in terms of the equity that people can get out of their homes, and of course contributed to wealth gaps as well. Wealth gaps specifically by race, I should say. So other studies have backed that up, and they've also found that homes in majority Black neighborhoods were appraised for 23% less than properties in most white neighborhoods. Even when the homes were similar quality, similar amenities, they controlled for all of those outside factors. So it really is, there can't be any other reason other than race for these disparities in appraisal amounts. And this is something we've been highlighting. It really blew up in 2020. This was one of the first stories that kind of went national out of Florida. A mixed race couple got an appraisal. They thought it was very low, so they removed all evidence of their Black family members, photos, cultures, etc., and the white partner stayed home. The second appraisal was $465,000. This was quickly followed by other stories. This was a Black homeowner in Chicago who also whitewashed the home, again, removing evidence of Black home ownership and who lived there. And her second appraisal jumped 62,000. This is out of Oakland, California, a 439,000 difference in their appraisal amounts. So this is just a significant issue. It's been very well known in Black communities, Black and brown communities, I would say. It was really encouraging that finally the media was paying attention. Awareness significantly increased. People have been reporting appraisal discrimination. It's easier to recognize. People are more willing to challenge it. And the industry has really been forced to change. One of the significant cases, there's a very powerful video linked of Doctors Connolly and Mott sharing their story. They filed suit against the appraisal company, the owner, and LoanDepot.com, alleging appraisal discrimination. Again, looking at their home, they found a second valuation came back more than $250,000 higher than the initial appraisal. They knew that this number, their initial number, wasn't right, and they really wanted to challenge it because they didn't want this to happen to other family members, other friends, and to their children in the future. So Dr. Mott was fighting cancer at the time and wanted to file the civil rights suit anyway, and in fact recorded her testimony to make sure that it was included. They just really wanted to stand up and challenge this illegal practice. Their law firm, Relman Colfax, a preeminent civil rights law firm, reached a landmark settlement with LoanDepot.com. So that's one of the three parties, but it's one of the 10 largest residential mortgage lenders in the country. So this is a settlement with large impact. They resolved the case specifically with the doctors and made decisions that they were, going to change how they conduct their business, which is really good news. Unfortunately, this settlement was announced about 12 days after Dr. Mott passed away. So she didn't get to learn of the verdict. But the family's continuing on. The law firm is continuing on. And we really appreciate that because Loan Depot committed to some significant changes. It's expected really to lead the industry now in terms of how to set up processes where people can request what's called a reconsideration of value, or ROV. Say, we don't believe this is right. Again, we need an individualized assessment here. They will make clear to applicants that they can ask for reconsideration. They're going to have training and certification. This is really important that any appraisers they use going forward need to certify that they have not been found to have discriminated. The other claims remain pending. So a significant start here. The Appraisal Institute has also made significant changes. So we're seeing some steps forward here. There's a really powerful documentary called Lowballed. It is linked here. If you'd like to learn more, we recommend that you watch it. And Doctors Connolly and Mott are featured in that, as well as other clients from across the country. So I will turn it back over to you, Bree, to talk about some cases. And we kind of designed this section to, again, show that discrimination can happen in any part of the process. So I think we'll start very early with advertising, but also some cases that show how it can be hard to uncover racial discrimination, identify it, and also that it can happen all the way throughout the process. Even after people have obtained their housing, there are fair housing protections. So we'll get started here with an advertising case.
Yeah, so this case comes out of Texas. This advertisement was put up that asks for not only does it call out no criminal history, but it also calls out to ask, it asks for a description of yourself. They ask for your race, they ask for your age, and a recent picture of you. They also call out absolutely no pets, which brings up another issue. But the biggest part of this was that this person wanted to see you and wanted to say whether or not someone could live there based on their race. And a Black woman did answer the ad. She did refuse to give a photo and did meet them in person. And then the landlord did refuse to allow her to even view the room or enter the home. He told that his wife would not like it because she is Black, and that renting a room to her would make other tenants uncomfortable. They stated that all the other tenants identified as Asian professionals. And so that's kind of the what they're trying to create in that housing.
Yeah, so often these ads that include these discriminatory limits and language are backed up by behavior, right?
Yeah, and then go to the next slide. Oh, it's sorry, it was lagging.
Yeah.
So Ding Train, he again refused to let her see the room. The case did go forward in place that there was discriminatory advertisements, discriminatory statements, refusal to rent because of race, and then also a retaliation because she ended up filing a case with HUD. The damages for this were totaling over 140,000. Additional things that we often see in cases was some fair housing training, but also in this case, some cultural sensitivity training. There was new policies to be added and equal housing opportunity language in the ads and the rental documents. So that was
Yeah, but
we often see ads. Some of them are not that overt. Some of it could be very just meeting you in person and then not asking exactly for your race and your age and things like that. They'd rather just meet you in person. It could be that simple.
it makes it harder to identify, right? And when I first saw this ad years ago, and this is an example that these cases can take time, I did not ever expect to see damages over 100,000, let alone 140,000. But it just revealed repeated violations and repeated problems. So one of the comments was that is so wrong. And, kudos to this woman for standing up and pursuing this case.
This case comes out of Michigan. There was an older Black veteran who had lived in California as an engineer. He moved back to the southwestern area of Michigan to be closer to his family. He was looking for senior housing, and he was looking for some, and he couldn't find some, so he just moved into what he could. As he was looking for his housing, he was seeking medical treatment, and was found something that was really close to his doctors in his hospital, and he was placed on the wait list there. It took him 2 buses to get to his doctor's house, his doctors and the hospital where he was currently living. This new place would put him right in the backyard almost to his treatment center. And then he was placed on, like I said, placed on the wait list. And then he was very friendly with the agent. She knew all about him. She knew about his family. She knew he was from California. She knew everything. And they were very kind to each other. She would ask about his family when he would call to check on where he was in the wait list. He had no suspicions that there was discrimination even occurring. The only reason he found out was that his white female neighbor was moving out, and they were talking about it, and he was really excited for her that she got into this place. And then he found out that she'd only been on the wait list for 2 months where he had been on the wait list for 7 years.
Mhm.
Testing and discovery had found that they were maintaining wait lists based on race. And so unfortunately, he did pass away in the time that this case was being pursued. His family did go forward with pursuing this case. And so that is something that I mean, Liz just talked about it with the appraisal case that
Mhm.
people's lives change and people can pass away during that time. In this instance, it could be that, the difference of him getting easier access to the hospital and the treatment plan. We talk about fair housing touches our life in all different aspects. And this could have been, it could have had a different outcome. Who knows?
Mhm.
But, he could have had easier access to medical treatment had he had access to that housing.
We do know he had to miss treatment sometimes because the bus was late or he couldn't get there on time to get the bus. So it does impact your life every day. Mhm.
This comes out of Louisiana. There was a family that tried to rent an apartment, and the landlord told them it was no longer available, which we commonly hear in this current housing market.
Mhm.
They were like, well, in case the people, change their minds, like we would like an application, and he still refused. Denise Thornton did suspect discrimination occurring, so she asked a white friend, Kathy Robinson, to ask about it, try to rent it. And when she called, he said it was available, and he invited her to stop by. Testing did find from the Greater New Orleans Fair Housing Center, now the Louisiana Action. Fair Housing Center, found that there was consistent preferential treatment to white testers compared to black testers, where there was no refusal to even show the apartment. Um, there was later, it was found that an anonymous letter was obtained that showed that the landlord was keeping a list of names of people and would include racial slurs next to this name of people and just signifiers on what the people, who they were, and whether or not he would rent to them. A case was then filed in federal court. There was a $172,500 in damages obtained, and then additionally, there was more. Uh, Sorry, if you want to go to the next slide.
I just want to say the fact that she got this letter anonymously, somebody in the industry working there knew this was wrong
Mhm.
and took a stand and sent her this information. And that really solidified the case. And so, it takes everyone to challenge these practices, and that includes housing professionals. And I do want to say we've had housing professionals report discrimination to us, whether it's down the street, the property is discriminating, or it's in their office. You can report discrimination anonymously. You cannot be asked as a professional to discriminate. So this made the news, as it should, and really brought the case forward and shows, this is modern times. This is still something we're seeing and does happen.
Oh, sorry. I thought this one was the same as last one.
Another case out of Louisiana, and we're
Yeah,
not
sorry,
picking on
that confused
Louisiana,
me.
but they've got a strong fair housing center, and some of these cases are important to learn from.
Yeah. So this is a different one. Sorry, I thought this was a continuation of the last one, but there is another one that out of Louisiana. This one is on steering, where the last one was on screening. There was both Apartment and Home Hunters Inc. and two landlords were steering African Americans away from privately owned rental units to more towards apartment complex at the request of different landlords. And there was even evictions based on race because of these companies were involved in. And they also had, not even on top of that, they also had restrictions against children, including the age and the number of children in certain units. This case was filed. There was an damages of 180,000. Which included $50,000 in a victims fund. Additionally, the housing provider was asked to change their policies, both on occupancy and additional ones. They also were required to advertise in minority communities. Now transitioning to some hate crimes and harassment, we'll cover some data from the FBI. The FBI reports that the most common location of hate crimes is in homes. And as we know, homes are a very vulnerable place. They're a safe place for many people. So for this to be occurring is very challenging and really hard. It has some studies have shown that hate crimes have been increasing nationwide over for 23 years. In 2023, record levels were reached. And then there's some data there based on bias and different motivation for these incidents. Race and ethnicity and ancestry tend to be the highest. And then looking at some data from the National Fair Housing Alliance, in 2023, harassment was the highest it's been, with over 1,500 cases. Or complaints that were reported. This was a 66% increase since last year. And of those 1,500 cases, 316 were based on race and 97 were based on color. Still a big, significant portion of those tend to be race and color. Oftentimes we talk about that it is people are afraid to report these things because of retaliation. But the Fair Housing Act does protect people. So if you are being retaliated against for exercising your fair housing rights, that is a protection in place and you can't be retaliated against. The Fair Housing Act does protect on harassment, and so it prohibits coercion, intimidation, threats, or interference with any person that is trying to exercise or enjoy their fair housing rights. This includes harassment based on race and national origin, and especially if it causes a person to vacate a dwelling or move. There's two different types of harassment that we see, this for that, so quid pro quo and hostile environment harassment. And as I said, retaliation is also protected. Owners, property managers, agents, all levels can be liable for harassment, especially if it is known about and they don't do anything to mitigate it. As well as tenants can also be held liable if they harass other tenants. So looking at the HUD rule on harassment, it again is anything that is threatening, intimidating, or interfering with their enjoyment of their dwelling. There can also, if somebody is being denied or limited uses or privileges or services associated, again, additional ones could be maintenance or repairs that aren't given because you're not engaging in maybe some harassment. Again, retaliation is protected. So if you again report it and it's still occurring, we have had cases like that, then that is still protected and you are not supposed to be subject to it. Looking at a case here out in Michigan, there was a Black woman who was living in a duplex. She was experiencing constant harassment because of her race. She was yelled at daily. There was racist language used. There was monkey noises being made. There was a lot of just, again, that I just lost the phrasing. The hostile environment, that was what I was looking for, hostile environment that was being created for this woman. The police were called on her as well. She did report it, and others did too, not just her. Other people were seeing that that was happening to her and it was being reported. However, the housing provider failed to intervene, even after us at the Fair Housing Center notified them that they had the responsibility to do so. We did help her file an administrative complaint alleging hostile environment harassment. And she was awarded $6,000 in monetary damage for emotional harm, and the housing provider agreed to implement a policy for changes and undergo fair housing training as well.
Yeah, so again, Bree, you talked about home being safe, and this is certainly not something that Ms. Hawkins experienced. So I'm really grateful our team was able to intervene and also appreciative that other people reported it. Something that's really important in terms of being able to establish that housing discrimination is occurring is proving it. So having other parties say, we're witnessing this, we're seeing this, you're responsible to address it, and for them to refuse built a strong case. But it doesn't undo the harm of what she lived through and many others have lived through. As we said, harassment is on the rise. It's all parties have responsibility, whether it's a neighbor, whether it's a housing professional, maintenance staff, it doesn't matter. If it's because of a protected class, including race, color, or national origin, steps can be taken. We must be vigilant to make sure that this does not continue to occur, and we want to stop this trend from, being on an upward tick. Thanks for sharing those examples with us, Bree. Another very hot topic in fair housing, developing kind of rapidly over the last 8-10 years, is the use of criminal records and background screening. This is another one of our cases here. We're changing our clients' names to protect their privacy, but for purposes of sharing this story, we called him Mr. Tyler, a Black man who contacted us with concerns that he was being denied housing because of his criminal history. The background policy, when we reviewed it, was really unclear and inconsistent, which is against best practices. According to the policy, he shouldn't even actually been denied. We also found additional fair housing concerns. That's often the case. Once we see one thing, there can be multiple issues, and we really want to address all of them so that we can prevent anyone else from going through this. Mr. Tyler suffered as a result of this discrimination. He did elect to file a HUD complaint. Our clients do have options in terms of how they want to proceed. So that's what he wanted to do. So the allegations were that the policy discriminated based on race, which is well established both by HUD guidance and recent court decisions. It has a disparate impact on people of color to have these types of policies because of our judicial system, which we'll look at some more data on that in a moment. Unfortunately, while the HUD investigation was occurring, he experienced prolonged homelessness, in part because he couldn't get housing, and that was inclusive of this denial. So we assisted him in negotiating a settlement that included $1,000 towards moving expenses. He was guaranteed immediate housing at the provider's location of his choice. So they offered multiple communities, as many do. So he was able to choose. He was given a credit towards 8 months of rent and a security deposit. He moved in this fall, and he won't have to pay rent until June of next year. So, really doing our best to rectify the situation. And thankfully, he is housed as now winter is upon us. Incarceration rates at the national and Michigan levels, there's an overrepresentation of Black Americans in the justice system. The Vera Institute is a great source for more information here. We recommend you connect with them if you're interested. Black men nationally constitute about 13% of the male population, but about 35% of those incarcerated. So clearly a disparate impact there. Studies have shown repeatedly, multiple studies, that Black people are more likely to be stopped by the police, detained pretrial, charged with more serious crimes, and sentenced more harshly when compared with white people, even when, again, controlling for things for equality across the board, looking at same offense, same severity of offense, and we find different sentences. The graphic on the left is Michigan data. So in Michigan, Black people constituted 15% of state residents at this time, but 37% of people in jail and 53% of people in prison. So while having a criminal record is not a protected class at the national or state level, and only in a few select communities, it's clear that there is a racial impact when these screening policies are imposed. So we have seen a lot more case law and guidance trying to rectify this. And as of April of this year, HUD put out new guidance. It does focus on the use of artificial intelligence, but is also really thinking about how applicants who are screened for rental housing are impacted, not only through the use of kind of screening technology, but just day-to-day decisions. And then advertising is also challenging to do on online platforms, and making sure that the information about the housing opportunity is conveyed without fair housing violations. They give some nice examples in the advertising guidance. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but they've seen evidence of racial discrimination when our ads that are targeted online, for example, to Black neighborhoods, have prominent notices for rental housing that say no criminal records and good credit only, while ads that were targeted to white neighborhoods don't have that type of language. Same thing for a mortgage ad for men. It has detailed information on the current rates, but ads that were sent to women simply say getting a mortgage is easy. This is not equal treatment. For the screening side, it's a really readable document, and I encourage you to check it out. They have established some guiding principles that make a lot of sense. They say any screening criteria that is used, if you do use it, should be relevant to housing and property safety, keeping people safe, keeping housing safe. They want accurate records only to be used. They want policies to be put in place and updated and then followed consistently. We should be transparent with applicants so they understand why they've been denied or any barriers that might preclude them from housing, and allow people the opportunity to challenge any negative information and records, because we know the record keeping is not perfect. The data is not perfect. Our systems are not perfect. And then housing providers should also be really looking for compliance with fair housing across their screening practices. There's also really interesting sections, especially for advocates as well as providers. They're really acknowledging that screening can have an unjustified discriminatory effect on protected groups, including race and color, national origin, as well as persons with disabilities, women, families with children, and survivors of domestic violence. These areas are credit history, eviction history, and of course, criminal records. It does include best practices. So again, I really encourage people to check it out. They were linked on our first slide there. But these additional considerations are really important. We screen for credit history. Credit history scores are really looking at what's your risk to be the recipient of a loan. How does that help us decide whether or not you're going to be a good tenant? I mean, what are we really trying to get at? And I think that's, will they pay their rent? So what can we look at that lets us know if they're going to pay their rent? Maybe income verification instead of using a credit score. Eviction history, what happened? How long ago? Do those circumstances still apply? Or have they been able to get a higher paying job? Have they been able to address the circumstances that led to eviction, whatever the case may be? And then, of course, they have a section on the use of criminal records and how that can be discriminatory. So one of your handouts is a fact sheet on criminal background screening. It really can be used from both an advocacy perspective and a compliance perspective. Just going to cover a couple of points here that have come out of all of this work. HUD is suggesting, not requiring, that it's not really effective to use criminal history to screen tenants for housing, because there really are no studies establishing that it helps you find good tenants. There may be some local laws and state laws, it's been proposed, we'll see what happens, that start to limit providers' abilities to run criminal background checks. So you have to stay on top of that conversation. If you have any federal or state funds, there's additional requirements often tied to those dollars. So you want to make sure you're in compliance with those. We have seen the use of technology really grow in the housing industry, especially on the rental side, but really across the board. And we know that the computer software designers have bias. And so the algorithms that are produced are biased. That's really one of the hottest areas of law right now. And there's, Facebook and Meta have been sued repeatedly. Other parties have been sued repeatedly for not checking for human bias in the software and algorithms used. It's really recommended that all policies are documented and applied consistently. It's suggested to, if you are looking at criminal history, first verify financial and other qualifications before considering criminal history. And then, of course, that policy should be applied across the board. New HUD guidance is also talking about protections for existing tenants. So right here it says, before evicting a tenant, provide them with the criminal record, provide them with the information that would be informing this decision, and allow them the opportunity to correct wrong information or explain the circumstances, what led to this. And only evict for criminal activity as a last resort and after that individualized assessment. That has become a real standard, both out of case law and best practices, is have that conversation. Make sure that information is accurate. Talk to the person directly. Never evict someone who's been a victim of a crime, and don't ban tenants, invited guests from visiting based on criminal involvement. And then again, housing providers should be documenting all of this. But this really could significantly open the door for a lot of people. About 1/3 of US adults have some sort of criminal record. So this is really an area where we're seeing a lot of change, new best practices, new understanding coming online. Anyone who is looking at criminal background really should focus on the nature and the severity and the recency of the criminal conduct. Again, it should be accurate information looking at what happened, How long ago? What have they done since? Has there been any other challenges, any other reoffenses? If not, this is something that shouldn't be considered anymore. Um, any screening really, again, should focus on keeping residents, people safe and the property safe. So differentiating between convictions for homicide, sexual assault, or arson and other convictions. Blanket bans, such as a no felonies policy or the ad that we saw earlier that just said no criminal record at all, those have been successfully and repeatedly struck down. So if properties are not updating their standards to keep up with this direction of where law and guidance is going, that's a fair housing risk. That's something that can be reported to a fair housing center. The individualized assessment, as I've referenced, is really critical. Making sure that the correct information is being used to make decisions is really critical, and having that opportunity to really engage about what is the information that's being used can really empower the tenant to better understand what the barrier might be to their housing, or hopefully, it's not a barrier anymore. We also want to encourage that any policy needs to be open to a request for an accommodation, which is a change that might be necessary for a person with a disability who has a disability-related need for that change. And that can include screening policies. So important to be aware of that as well. I want to briefly talk about testing, and then we'll look at reporting housing discrimination before we wrap up for questions. Testing is a program that Fair Housing Centers and the Civil Rights Movement has used for decades. It's an investigative tool using volunteers who simulate kind of ordinary housing transactions, visiting an open house, making phone calls to inquire about loans, inquiring about rentals, etc. We can use testing to investigate all types of housing and housing-related services. If you are working in the housing industry, you are not eligible to be a tester, but others certainly would be eligible. It's very important to establish what happened. When we have a black tester and a white tester visit a home for sale and they receive drastically different information, they're not taken seriously or treated equally, that helps establish that there's a pattern of discrimination occurring, that this is a practice of this housing professional. So it's really important to establish what happened. It's literally something that we compare side by side. For a rental test, were they given the same availability? Were they given the same pricing? Were they given the same perks? Were they given the right information about how to apply? All of that can really determine whether the housing search is successful. So it's a really important program that we still conduct today. We train our testers and retrain. We make sure they're very comfortable. And essentially, we're looking at the quality of the service, what they were asked, what the information they were provided with, and really how they were treated. So if you're interested in volunteering as a tester, you have to be 18 or older. Please do contact our Fair Housing Center and we'll get you in touch with Sarah Brandt, who is our test coordinator and really a phenomenal human. In terms of reporting housing discrimination, I think we talked about this briefly, but I really want to highlight, we understand that people can be reluctant to report housing discrimination. And that's why it's so important that anyone who identifies it reports it. There's no limits on who can report discrimination to us. We've had real estate agents file complaints as well as their clients. They also suffer a harm. If they don't get that sale, they lose their income related to that sale. So we've had industry report it. We've also had them report it just because it's wrong and they don't want to see it. It gives, the profession a bad name. We've had all types of different housing professionals and government officials, advocates, you name it, who have witnessed discrimination or suspect discrimination, bring it to us. What we're seeing in our case data is a tiny portion of what we suspect are millions of incidents of illegal housing discrimination that's estimated to occur across the country every year. It often goes undetected or unreported. It can be difficult to identify, difficult to prove or document what happened. And we know and we acknowledge that victims of housing discrimination often can feel that nothing can be done or will be done when they report it. There's also the fear of retaliation that Bree mentioned. They're afraid of losing their housing. When the market is so tight and it's so expensive right now, people are putting up with more, and they shouldn't have to, but we certainly sympathize with their fear. Even their neighbors might discourage reporting. It's so important that it be brought forward, but we do want to acknowledge that we understand why people are afraid to do so. Again, Bree mentioned it and we want to reiterate it. People who try to exercise their fair housing rights, it doesn't matter if there's evidence of discrimination or not. they are protected. They cannot be retaliated against. Their rent shouldn't be increased. They shouldn't be evicted. They shouldn't be non-renewed. They shouldn't be charged fees. They shouldn't be treated badly or harassed because they filed a fair housing complaint. All of these are things that have happened. So we really want people to understand that they are protected. There's also whistleblower protection for a staff member to report discrimination, on behalf of their company who is providing housing. They cannot be required to discriminate, and they are allowed to report it. That has happened a handful of times in my years at the Fair Housing Center. So we really appreciate people who are willing to let us know what's happening. You can report it anonymously to us in the education department as well, and we can just pass it on to the advocacy and enforcement team for follow-up. Your name does not have to be attached to it. So we have some tips for reporting discrimination. It's the 3 R's. Remember, record, and report. So what happened when? What information can you gather? Write down names, addresses, save those screenshots, keep those emails, make copies of everything, talk to the people involved, create a timeline of what happened. That's so helpful to moving the case forward. And report it on our website by calling, by setting up an appointment. We will walk you or the clients through questions that will help you learn more and understand what next steps might be. Our Fair Housing Center covers the counties here that are colored in kind of that teal green. We are your local Fair Housing Center. Feel free to reach out to us. If you are in a different service area, we will make sure to connect you to the right local agency. We're also work very closely with Michigan Department of Civil Rights. They also accept fair housing complaints, as does HUD. As we mentioned, we'll do any intake that we can. We'll do it anonymously. We can work directly and advocate for clients. If they give us permission to contact their landlord, we'll make a phone call. We'll send a letter. All of our decisions and steps that we make are directed by the client. We have intake and enforcement coordinators who handle our cases, so we encourage you to reach out directly to them. But if you want to be anonymous, you can reach out directly to our education and outreach department. The more information we have, the better. So the sooner we get the information, the better. There is a statute of limitations. In Michigan, it's up to 3 years for potential to file different types of fair housing cases under state law. So we want to make sure that we're timely as best we can so that we can do that investigation and get the ball rolling for enforcement. Our clients can choose between kind of that advocacy or mediation, kind of the low end if they'd like. Sometimes a phone call is enough to say, get the sale back on track or get the rental lease agreement signed, corrected and signed, maybe things like that. But people do have the right to file administrative complaints. That is a paperwork-based process where you file a complaint with HUD or the Michigan Department of Civil Rights or the local government. For example, Grand Rapids, Kentwood, Wyoming, Holland, they all have local fair housing ordinances. It's within their purview, so it's their responsibility to enforce that local law. So we would work with them to do that. The option for litigation is always there for federal and state court. Some cases would qualify for a Department of Justice investigation. They tend to do large pattern and practice type cases. They've been doing a lot about sexual harassment of late, for example. We do have private attorneys that do cooperate with us that sometimes will take cases that we refer. So there's lots of options to pursue fair housing complaints and to pursue justice. What's the outcome? What happens at the end? It depends on, of course, the unique circumstances, but if the property is still available and the client still wants it, we would do our best to secure that apartment, buy that home, etc. We always want to see training. We want people to know how to comply with fair housing laws. So that's something that we always want to see in any sort of settlement. Of course, we want to see new policies in place or changes in discriminatory policies made. And sometimes the victims can receive compensation, not always. It does depend on exactly the unique circumstances and what they might qualify for. But that is certainly something that is sometimes considered in the outcomes of cases. So we are open to take questions. We've got a little bit of time. We'll stay on to make sure that we can do that, but we'll conclude the recording here. We have some suggestions about other ways you can get involved and encourage you to think about that, but really encourage you to report discrimination if you see it. We're also open to presenting to other groups, connecting with groups. You can get our e-newsletter. You can become a member. Some of you can volunteer. And I guess one more here. And we will have evaluations for you. I think we can share the link too in the chat. If you want a certificate, you can request that.